I was fearful of them looking down on my dad. Not so much the way that they would look at me any differently. I didn't want anyone to talk badly about him. That was more what my concern was. Because then I wouldn't know how I would react, and I would probably, especially growing up, not react to that in a very healthy way and probably just cause more conflict than was necessary. So it was more just protective of his legacy and his memory more than anything. As an adult now, and as someone who's in long-term sobriety and recovery, I realize the language I use now is destigmatizing, right? I didn't have that back then. I just saw it as protecting my dad's name. And destigmatizing, the definition of it is just removing shame, right? Removing shame from the equation. Like my dad suffered from a deadly disease, the same disease that I have, the same disease millions of people have, right? And some survive it, some don't. And that's just the fact of the matter, right? It doesn't mean that my dad or me or anybody who suffers from this disease is fundamentally a bad person or should be seen as less than. And so, again, I didn't have any of this sort of language or vocabulary growing up, and maybe that made things harder because I couldn't articulate it like I can now. And so I think with age, experience, and maturity, I've gained the vocabulary to be able to have these sorts of conversations.
Welcome back to Kids of Overdose, the show where we hear stories from people who have lost a parent to drug overdose and addiction. In episode 4, we are talking to Trevor. I found his beautifully written article in the discourse and was amazed at how many things he and I have in common. Both our dads died when we were 5 years old. We've both been told that we have our dad's smile. Our parents were separated, but not divorced. And we both have very close relationships with our dad's brother. Trevor is a comedian, a writer, and has a very interesting perspective as someone who has also battled addiction himself. I'm your host, Candice. Thank you again for listening to Kids of Overdose.
My name is Trevor Jang. I come from Vancouver, BC, Canada. I'm mixed race heritage. I'm Chinese Canadian on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I'm actually indigenous. Up here in Canada, known as First Nations. I come from a journalism and media background. I'm a writer. I'm a stand-up comedian now, where I talk a lot about addiction and recovery. The crazy thing is, like, you and I were both 5 years old when we lost our dads, and that's a crazy connection that we have firsthand. That at that age, the memories are scarce and slim, but there are some, right? At 5 years old, you're old enough to have some memories, and I do hold those dear. And I've been blessed to have good relationships with my dad's siblings, my aunt and my uncles, and they've helped to fill in the blanks on who he was and really helped to paint a picture of the great guy that he was, the funny guy that he was. He had a really big heart, a really big smile, and a big presence. So when you walked into the room, people noticed him. And that's been the common theme that I've heard about my dad.
Does anybody ever tell you that you remind them of him?
Yeah, it's really trippy for my aunts and uncles and my mom, right? It's because I'm right around the same age now that he was when he passed away, and I'm turning that age this year. He was 33 when he passed away, and I'll be turning 33 in June 2025, and so that's coming up. And so I've been reflecting a lot on that. So these past few years, as I've entered my 30s, I've been the age that he was that my family members last remember him. And so it's been, in particular, these last couple of years, it's been really trippy for my uncle. I live with my uncle, my dad's brother. And so he sees me every day, and he has to take a double glance every once in a while when I turn a corner, or just everyday stuff, right? Like when I'm like doing my laundry or something, just the way I move around the house. We have very similar ways of entering and leaving rooms, or tilting our head, or just those subtle genetic stuff. And it's weird how those little things stand out. But also, like, my sense of humor, I've been told I get from him. It was actually my dad's dream to become a comedian. And
Oh,
so it's
wow.
been really, yeah, I never got the chance to pursue it. There's a lot of reasons for that, addiction mostly, right? But it's been really cool that I've gotten to pursue comedy and feel like I'm living his dream in a sense. But yeah, so I definitely get my sense of humor from him. I look a lot like him, and I know that really, yeah, is really trippy for my family members and the people that remember him. I've caught up with some of his old friends who hadn't seen me since I was a little kid and hadn't seen him since, 25 years, and they just are in shock because yeah, because they're staring at their old friend again almost. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
My dad passed away. He was 25. But I know that when I was turning 25, for some reason, like ever since I'm a kid, I think like that I'm gonna die around that age too. Does it make you feel weird that you're gonna be his age?
Yeah, I'm in recovery from alcoholism and addiction myself, right? And so for 15 years, basically from the age of 15 to 30, I battled active addiction on and off. And so there were definitely points in time where I didn't really see myself making it to that age either. I romanticized addiction and dying young, and that's trauma, right? And that's trauma giving you those kinds of thoughts. So I battled really heavy depression and things like that growing up. And we're living in an overdose crisis. So that's the other piece of it, right? So in I live in Vancouver and we're the epicenter of the overdose epidemic in Canada at least. So, just for context for listeners from the States, we have 6 people a day dying of overdose in British Columbia. And most of those people who are dying are single men. Overdose has become the leading cause of death for young people in the province. And so there's that factor, right? And so for me, when alcohol is playing a role in my life, I eventually turn to drugs, right? And I start doing very risky self-sabotaging, self-destructive behavior. And there's a very real chance that if I would have kept going on the path that I was going, that I very likely would have died around the same age, if not sooner. And I know that should I go back to that lifestyle, it probably wouldn't be very long before something like that happened or something else. So on the positive side of all that, thinking about turning 33, my sober day is also actually my birthday too. So when I turn 33 in June, I will also be turning 3 years sober. And that was very intentional. I wanted to give myself this birthday gift every year where when I turn a new age, I'm celebrating not only another trip around the sun, but another year of sobriety and recovery. But this one upcoming will be super special. Just the magnitude and the weight of breaking that cycle. The big thing for me right now is just trying to honor my dad's memory by not going down the same path.
That leads me to a quote that I pulled from your article in the discourse. And one thing that I really liked about your story and how you share it is personal, but from a very journalistic standpoint, which is so insightful for people. And one thing you said is children of addicts are twice as likely to develop substance abuse issues as our peers. The moment my father's heart stopped, I also became more likely to grow up with a mental illness. 1 in 5 children who experience the early death of a parent are likely to develop a psychiatric disorder. So, am I doomed to repeat my father's mistakes and ultimately meet the same fate? Or are there ways for me and kids like me to rewrite our stories? It seems like you're on the path of rewriting your story, right?
Yeah, I got chills when you read that because and I find it funny, but a lot of people won't find it funny. When I wrote and published that story in the discourse in 2017, I was still in active addiction.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Okay.
yeah, and so it's ironic hearing those words, knowing that I was writing it while struggling. In a way, it was super cathartic, and in a way, I was nowhere near ready to write that story. But that's just the way it happened. That's just my heart wanted to speak to that, and the artist in me and the writer in me wanted to get that story out, and I pushed it out. I pushed that boulder up the hill, but it definitely took its toll. I definitely re-traumatized myself in the process, and I definitely spiraled and ended up leaving journalism actually very shortly thereafter. Not only because of that story, but that was a big piece of it. And that's a story for another day. I took a meandering journey in my career, and I've ended up in a good place. But during that time, like 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, those were pretty prime addiction years for me, pretty peak addiction years for me. While I was a journalist, just running around, advancing my career, but also destroying myself inside. And it's very ironic to hear those words now. It was almost like manifesting a better future for myself or manifesting some hope for myself because I did eventually get to a point where I now am actually rewriting my story. I've returned to that essay that I published all those years ago. And I'm doing stand-up comedy where I do talk about my father in a funny way, and I do talk about addiction in a fun, funny way. So I am rewriting my story, but at that time that I actually wrote that, I definitely was not.
Sometimes when I'm trying to tell people about what happened with my dad and my own story, I get it jumbled up. I don't know exactly where to begin. It's just like the order in which I tell it. It's just, I'm still working on it. But I love that you went through it chronologically with the timeline. It was so easy to follow. And even how your dad's life and your life mixed together and related in different things that you went through. What was your relationship like with your dad?
Yeah, I remember like I said, he was just a super loving guy and he loved his kids. He loved me, and my sister's younger by a few years. So unfortunately, she doesn't have memories of him. She was only 2 when he passed. He loved spending time with me. I was like a little mini him, right? And then he took me everywhere that he went, and he was always so proud to introduce me. So yeah, my earliest childhood memories are in, it sounds weird, but my earliest childhood memories are actually inside of a bar. A little bit of foreshadowing for my life. But my grandpa, my dad's dad, he owned a little kitchen and restaurant that was attached to a bar in Vancouver's downtown east side. Bit of an infamous place in Vancouver anyways. It's called the Ivanhoe. A lot of interesting characters came through that place in the 90s. My dad worked in the kitchen, and so that's where he worked. And I spent a lot of time with my aunt, my dad's sister, who lived nearby, and cousins who were all the same age. And so my aunt would take me and my cousins down to the Ivanhoe to visit my dad for lunch or for dinner. And then they even would bring us into the bar sometimes and give us Jello in a little shooter glass that we could slurp
Oh,
on. Little stuff like that. So those are my earliest childhood memories are inside of a bar. But with that said, to me, what I remember from that atmosphere is laughter and community and people coming together and family coming together, right? So I have a lot of like mentors in sobriety and recovery that I've really bonded with and told and confided in and told my story to. And they really mirror for me and reflect back to me the fact that I lost my dad when I was 5, but he gave me this 5 powerful years of a powerful bond, right? And it's like he gave me enough of a grounding in myself that I knew who I was and I knew where I come from. And so even though I stumbled along my own journey with substances, there was enough of a foundation of love there that I knew at the end of the day that I had this family that loved me, the people that are still alive that love me. But ultimately, I knew, spiritually speaking, that my dad never left me. He's still with me in those realms. That's what I believe, anyways. And so that loving connection is still there. And it's something that I could always find my way back to eventually.
you kept close with your dad's family, so that must have helped to keep his memory alive and different things and easier to talk about him.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, my dad's siblings really made a conscious effort to keep my mom and me and my sister a part of the family. They really made sure that we were at every gathering and they were at every single one of my birthdays. And like I grew up with my cousins as basically my brothers, and those are all cousins from my dad's side of the family. My aunt and my uncles, they really all made an effort to keep my dad's memory alive, to talk about him. They were never scared or awkward about talking about him around me. It must still continue to be really trippy for them, the fact that I look so much like him, right? And so it's weird for me because I know that there's a piece of my dad that lives on in me that they get to see, but I don't get to see it because I am it. And
Yeah.
so it's yeah, yeah, it's weird for me, but I know that it's special for them, and that's been really cool. But yeah, my relationship with my dad's family has really helped to fill that void. It's a large father-sized void that different members of the family have taken turns filling more at different points in time. Everyone stepped up to the plate in their own way at various points in time and have collectively filled that void.
How old were you when you found out that your dad died from an overdose?
To be honest, I can't actually remember. I So I was told when it happened and I was 5, I was just told that he got really sick. I remember that. And on my 13th birthday, my aunt, my dad's sister, told me the full story that it was that he was speedballing cocaine and heroin and he had gone to rehab and gotten clean and sober. And I remember visiting him in rehab actually. And so he had gotten some sobriety time and then relapsed. And because his tolerance had dropped from being clean for some time, when he went back to the same amount that he was using prior, he overdosed. That's a very common story. So that I was told that full story on my 13th birthday. And I think between 5 and 13, I had gotten little tiny bits. So I don't know exactly when I had learned that it was an overdose or that it was related to drugs or addiction. I'm not sure. But I knew by the time I was 13, I knew the full story.
Okay. And how did you take that?
Not to pin this on my aunt or anything, but that was not only was that the moment that I heard the story for the first time, it was also the moment I had my first drink. So I coped with it with alcohol. And I didn't begin drinking alcoholically until a few years later. I would say about 15 or 16. But I forever associated that story with alcohol. And there's different schools of thought that some people are born alcoholics or addicts, and others drink themselves or use themselves into it. I'm pretty sure I was born one, and I would have become one regardless of whether or not my dad passed away or not. But this was just such a gallon of gasoline on the fire, so to speak. And at the time, it was heavy, but like I said, I had such a big loving family that I was glad to know the full story. And it felt like it matured me in a certain way. I felt like I had this sort of depth of life experience that a lot of my peers didn't, and that in a strange way felt cool. But in the long run, I yeah, dove into binge drinking and partying, and that was my escape as I got older. I did some counseling when I was very young after he died. I don't remember that, but basically what the counselor told my mom at that time was that I would most likely end up burying it in some way. It would come out in other ways, but it would come to the surface again when I was an adult. That was
Uh-huh.
what was likely going to happen, and that's exactly what happened. So I really spiraled into some severe mental health and addiction issues around 18, 19, 20, ended up at a treatment center when I was 22, and then stabilized to a certain extent and did some ongoing counseling and things. But I continued to drink and use and party throughout my 20s. And yeah, but that through therapy and sobriety and recovery, I can trace all of these patterns back to losing him and the weight of that story and that statistic that you read from my story, right? It's been reported that children of addicts are twice as likely to develop substance abuse issues. And also, if you lose a parent at a young age, you're more likely to develop a psychiatric disorder. And my life has proven both those things to be true, at least in my own life. Not to say that it has to happen. If anybody's listening and they've lost a parent, or they're the surviving parent and they have kids that have lost a parent and you're worried about your kids, it doesn't have to be that way. With enough support and counseling and all of those other things. At the end of the day, my dad wouldn't have wanted me to go down that path. And as much as I romanticized his life and addictions as wanting that kind of lifestyle for my own, I know that at the end of the day, he didn't want that for me.
You said that when your aunt had told you what happened, you were 13. Did you share this story with your friends? What was it like talking about it? Or was it something that you hid?
That's a good question. I was trying to remember that. My closest friends knew. Yeah. And it wasn't something that we talked about a lot, but it was something that my closest friends knew. I had a really good friend in high school who also lost his dad to something else. And so
Uh-huh.
so we bonded over that. And even my other friends, they hadn't gone through any sort of trauma like that. It wasn't, they didn't look at me any different. So I was pretty blessed that way. I had a good group of friends growing up. But beyond my close friends, I would say that there was and is a bit of a stigma around addiction in general and substance abuse in general, but like losing a parent in that way. Growing up, I think there was, and it wasn't something, it was always something that I was careful not to broadcast. Growing up, I was very cognizant that not everyone needed to know, and there's a lot of closed-minded people out there, right?
The stigma surrounding it and the closed-minded people, what were you fearful of them finding out?
I was fearful of them looking down on my dad. Not so much the way that they would look at me any differently. I didn't want anyone to talk. down or talk badly about him. That was more what my concern was. Because then I wouldn't know how I would react to that. And I would probably, especially growing up, not react to that in a very healthy way and probably just cause more conflict than was necessary. So it was more just protective of his legacy and his memory more than anything. And as an adult now, and as someone who's in long-term sobriety and recovery, it's I realize it's the language I use now is destigmatizing, right? I didn't have that back then. I just saw it as protecting my dad's name, but now I see
Okay.
it as destigmatizing. And destigmatizing, the definition of it is just removing shame, right? Removing shame from the equation. Like my dad suffered from a deadly disease, the same disease that I have, the same disease that millions of people have, right? And some survive it, some don't. And that's just the fact of the matter, right? It doesn't mean that my dad or me or anybody who suffers from this disease is fundamentally a bad person or should be seen as less than. And so, again, I didn't have any of this sort of language or vocabulary growing up, and maybe that made things harder because I couldn't articulate it like I can now. And so I think the with age and experience and maturity, I've gained the vocabulary to be able to have these sorts of conversations.
Where do you think, and I know that this is a hard question, but I'm just curious, where do you think these stigmas come from?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Just human ignorance, human flaw. Nobody's perfect, right? Like
Yeah.
we know what we've grown up around. Again, I've gained a lot of, I don't know, wisdom from those who have been walking the recovery path a lot longer than me. And it's been pointed out that everybody in some way, shape, or form is emotionally sick and often wrong, myself included. And so whether you suffer from a diagnosed mental illness or addiction or not, everyone is has their flaws and their issues and their idiosyncrasies and their biases, conscious or otherwise. And
Yeah.
to that understanding, I approach it from more of a place of compassion than anything. And I think a lot of
Do you think it's
people,
like human nature?
to a certain extent, but that I don't want to say 100% yes on that because I feel like that can be a bit of an excuse. And I don't want to excuse discrimination and or whatever, but to a certain extent, yes. And I also think a big piece of it is just fear, right? People are scared of drugs. People are scared of the unknown. People are scared of a lifestyle that is unfamiliar to theirs, seen as more dangerous or seen as so. I think a lot of it is a lot of stigma is driven by fear as well as just a misunderstanding.
Do you have triggers or certain things that make you upset about your loss? Or
Yeah,
maybe
having to do interviews about it. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I know. As I'm asking this question, I'm like, ugh,
Just to give a real answer to that question, I'll be brief, but
sorry.
other people's grief can trigger my grief for sure. And
Yeah.
I don't think you have to lose someone to an overdose to know what I'm talking about, but like I'm a very empathetic person, and so when someone else has suffered a loss, that that can trigger my own grief. So that's something that I've learned about myself for sure.
What experiences have helped you cope and process this trauma and get to the other side of it where you are now?
Yeah, I've talked a lot about my own addictions, and you'll hear it a lot from people in recovery that drugs and alcohol were not the problem, they were the solution, right? To deeper emotional wounds. And for a long time, drugs and alcohol were my solution, right? Because I didn't have the tools or the supports to process an extreme loss like that, childhood trauma like that, intergenerational trauma that was going on as well. And so for the longest time, drugs and alcohol were my solution until they started creating problems that were just as big as the original problem, right, in my own life. And so every person living with addiction knows that crossroads where the solution no longer works. And you have to either choose to continue spiraling or take the leap of faith and try something else and try recovery. So nowadays, it's recovery, It's sobriety, it's ceremony. I've really fallen deep onto my indigenous side in terms of practicing ceremony and deepening my own spirituality, and that is huge. I have a big
What is ceremony?
like so up here in Canada, at least anyways, we have different like sweat lodge ceremonies or just getting
Okay.
out in community and things like that. Just practicing those spiritual beliefs and cultural beliefs. There's a lot of just powerful healing that's available through that world, and that's been a big part of my healing journey, as well as a big circle of support just from the recovery community here in Vancouver. It's very vibrant and a lot of just amazing, incredible people. And also, yeah, so just like creative outlets like writing, right? We've spoken about writing. I am writing a book about all this. I'm very excited to share that with you in the future.
Yes, absolutely. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a journey. It's a marathon. It's a long journey, but I'm enjoying the journey. It's very cathartic.
How long have you been writing it?
It started with that story back in
Oh,
2017,
okay.
the beginnings of it. And like I said, I may have harmed myself at the time writing that story, but at the same time, it gave me something to turn back to when I was in a better place to actually start writing that story. It was like, oh yeah, I got 10,000 words that I can pick up again now that I feel strong enough and stable enough to tackle this. And like I said, in the long run, that was just the way that it had to happen. I don't really regret that because it gave me the foundation. That as well as stand-up comedy. Like I said, I started doing comedy for the recovery community. That's
Okay.
how I got my start in comedy. So yeah, performing for other people who are sober and other people who've been impacted by addiction, and really just focusing on the humorous side of being an addict or an alcoholic, right? Because there are a lot of funny things that happen along the way. So just sharing my story and my funny stories, but also with the positive message of hope that you can come out the other side of it, right? But getting to that point where you can laugh at yourself and you and others can laugh with you at that, it just creates a bonding and a sense of community. And now I'm taking the comedy to outside the recovery community to more of the mainstream population. And in that capacity, I really see it as, again, another tool of destigmatizing addiction. So all of these things are a big piece of my healing.
What advice would you give to somebody who's struggling with processing the substance-related death of their parent?
So hard. It really depends on the age, right? If it's a kid like we were, it's really and it's awful for the surviving parent. They're in such a impossible situation, but giving as much love and care and support as you can to that kid is super important. If they lose a dad, trying to find them other positive male role models. If it's a mom, trying to find them other positive female role models. There's not going to be any one person that can fill that void. It's going to take a village to really keep, again, if it's speaking from my experience and the experience that you share with me, if you're a kid when this happens, then yeah, there really has to be a village that rallies around you. And I've been super blessed to have that for big chunks of my life. If you're a little older, if you're a teenager or an adult, even when you go through this, knowing that I've lived with grief all my life, you will actually eventually get to the point where you don't actually want the grief to go away because it's a reminder of that person and how special that bond was.
I can relate to that. Do any specific movies, songs, or places resonate when it comes to your dad or things that make you think of him?
The song Don't Speak by No Doubt, that
Okay.
played at his funeral and he loved that
Oh.
song. And yeah, that song in particular, whenever I hear it, it brings me right back. So it used to be a very triggering song, but now
Okay.
it's a little bit more like nostalgic.
Yeah. Now it's a good feeling when I hear that song.
Do you ever feel like he's with you?
Oh, totally. Maybe you can relate to this. The thing about losing a parent at such a young age is that you think about death, right? So to an unhealthy degree, at least I did, you become sort of fascinated by it, but you begin to think about life and death and the meaning of things and the universe and what happens afterwards, and all these sorts of things. So for me, I began to develop a very deep spiritual curiosity after he passed away. And that's something that's really deepened through sobriety and recovery and practicing ceremony and all those sorts of things. And so as I've nurtured my own spiritual growth, I have felt my connection to him grow as well. I used to be able to hear him when I was very young. And then as I lost my way and lost my connection to myself, I couldn't hear him anymore. And then I lost that for those 15 something years that I was lost in addiction. But then as I've come back to myself in recovery, I've started to be able to hear it again.
Losing a parent suddenly can leave you with many unanswered questions
Yeah.
that you'll never get the answers to. Are there any burning questions that you have that you're just never going to know the answer?
Curious what our relationship would be like today as adults. Yeah, you at some point in the journey, the grief shifts from grieving the past to grieving the future. Like if I have kids one day, they're not going to meet their grandfather, and if I get married one day, my dad's not going to be there. So these when I this forward thinking grief is where I'm at now. It's yeah, and it's just this curiosity of yeah, what would our friend because we'd be friends today, and what would that friendship be like? I can get a sense of it because my uncle and I are friends, and my dad's brother, and they were only a year apart, and they were similar in a lot of ways. The void has been filled collectively by different people, and I get little flashes of what could have been, but it's never going to be the real thing. And so that's what I wonder today is what would our relationship be like today?
If you could talk to him one last time or tell him anything or ask him, what would it be?
That's a great question. I find myself, I don't want to use the word praying to him, but talking to him in that spiritual sense of things. And sometimes I feel like I can in tune answers, whether or not that's him or whether or not that's my own sort of higher self. Doesn't even really matter if it's cathartic for me. But yeah, am I on the right track? Am I doing the right thing? What again, it's my own curiosity. Where you at? What happens after you pass, right? It's more
Okay.
of those things. What are you up to on the other side? It's those kinds of things. But in terms of my own life, am I doing the right thing? Yeah.
This was great. When I started this journey, I never got to meet anybody else who's lost a parent to overdose. And now I've met so many extraordinary people, you being one of them, and it's helped me so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Oh, well, I just wanted to, yeah, thank you, Candice, for taking this project on and creating this platform. Like you, right? There just wasn't, I also didn't grow up knowing anyone else that had lost a parent in this way, or even anyone who had lost a parent until later on. And so, yeah, you definitely grow up feeling very alone. And so if this podcast can help families feel a little bit less alone, then I think you've done something pretty incredible. And it's pretty incredible that you and I, not only did we both lose our dad to an overdose, but we were both 5 years old. And so I think that's a really powerful connection that you and I share. And yeah, it's just been great getting this chance to chat through all this stuff.
Yeah, and our parents were both separated but not divorced.
Right.
There were other things in your article that also matched with me. I'm very close to my dad's brother, my Uncle
Mhm.
Joey, and we talk on the phone all the time. And me and my mom ended up moving in at my grandparents' house, my dad's parents. So I've been close with my dad's family all the time. And they say I have his smile. And I talk a lot about death and so many things that you just said. And it makes me feel good that I'm not just a weirdo. Like, it's just because we're like this, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure you are a weirdo, but there's nothing wrong
Oh,
with that. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with
thanks.
being a weirdo. I think these sorts of experiences are what make us are what we are, and some people would call that weird, but I think it's pretty special.
If anybody's interested in looking you up and seeing like
Yeah, if you
what
want to
you're
follow
working
my journey,
on,
I share quite a bit of content on Instagram. Just my handle is just my name, Trevor Jang. Yeah, if you want to check me out, I share a lot of comedy content on there. And as I work through this longer term book project, I'll be sharing updates on there as well.
Getting to talk to someone who has such a similar loss to mine has been very therapeutic for me. I was hoping for validation in some of the things that I've thought about and felt throughout my life. Luckily, I did get that. Trevor reminded me that kids like us who have lost a parent so young often will think about death, a lot more than other kids. As a kid, I would have fears about my other family members and close friends dying. I was worried about who would be next, and I thought it would be soon. Luckily, it wasn't. His funny sense of humor reminded me that many of us who go through trauma can find a lighter side of life where it makes it easier to look past some of the hard things once in a while. Humor can be very healing. I hope you enjoyed this episode and you'll join me again next week. I'm currently looking for more people to interview for the show. So if you've lost a parent to overdose or you know someone who has that you think might be interested in speaking, please reach out to me. You can visit my website at kidsofo.com. That's KIDSOFO.com. Thanks again for listening to Kids of Overdose. Goodbye.